Welcome. This is our segment on sewing. We're just going to give a brief overview on the stitches, fabric, and techniques we use for sewing puppets. So first of all, let's talk about fabric, because you might be curious what people use. Mostly it's fleece that people use to cover puppets. You can buy fleece anywhere. You can buy like this kind of fleece is found at many just local craft stores. It's the cheap stuff. You can get the anti-pill stuff, which has this nice, lovely texture. But the stuff I like to use is this stuff. This stuff is called Antron fleece. I believe it was first developed for car upholstery. So it's really strong. It has a nice stretch to it, one direction. And it also dyes really well. It's a polyester fabric, but it takes on dyes very, very well. You got to kind of test it though, because some dyes react differently and all that boring stuff. So real quick, I want to show you how to do 3 different types of stitches, because the 3 main ones that I use are the ladder stitch, the baseball stitch, and the whip stitch. So first of all, let's try the ladder stitch. So first thing you need to do is get your pin cushion. This is my pin cushion. I love this pin cushion. There is some pink elephant in Africa screaming in pain right now because I practice voodoo all over its butt. So you get your needle, a nice good needle, and then you have your thread. I'm using a nice dark thread. Usually you want to have thread that matches your fabric, but for the purposes of demonstration, I will use this nice dark thread. Just give it a snip. Take out your needle, thread your needle, and here's something. So you take a piece of thread and you double it up just like that. And then you take the other end and you knot it. And this makes it so every stitch you do twice as strong than just doing one thread. Clean it up a little bit. And then the ladder stitch. When you start your stitch, you just poke it into the fabric just like this. You pull it on through and you just come back through here, your nice little loop you made, and then boom, you're knotted, you're ready to go. So take a little bit, you go in and out on one side, pull it through and do the exact same thing on the other side. You go in, out, you're just grabbing a little bit. You want to try to stay consistent. I usually try to grab like 2 millimeters length of fabric, a little closer together if I'm trying to be a little more clean, but just like that. And it's called a ladder stitch because, I'll show you, it looks like a little ladder. So you're gonna have like, your threads coming across are gonna be parallel, just like that, just like the rungs on a ladder. And when you pull them, they're gonna cinch up nice and tight. And if you have the right kind of fleece, which most fleeces will disappear like that, you'll have a nice clean seam. Because as most people know, when you're making a puppet, you want to have seamless puppets. It looks good. You're able to see the character more. Like some of these people, like, let me grab this guy. You see him, there is a seam, I don't know if you can see it, going right up the front of his face. And I used the ladder stitch and I was able to hide the seam, because you do 2 things. You use the ladder stitch and that hides the seam, and then you'll come in and you will use a needle or a pin, and you can go in and you can pull that fluff. It's called pile. You go in there and you pick out the pile from within the seam, and that makes it to where your seam vanishes. You'll still be able to see it, but most of the time when you're performing, you're in a big auditorium, or maybe you're doing something for television, and for the most part, it's not gonna be able to pick it up if you do it right. So the ladder stitch is good if you're wanting to sew onto the form like this, but if you want to do the baseball stitch, it's good if you have a pattern cut out and you want to be able to sew it off the foam or whatever you're using to sew over. And with that one, it's very similar to the ladder stitch, because you go in and you start the stitch by coming from the outside. Just think of like the threads on a baseball. So you just go in, just around like that. So attacking from the outside, puncturing through the inside and repeating. And that'll pull tight and that'll make a nice little stitch. This isn't the cleanest, but that's the principle. And that is really nice if you have something you want to glove over something else. Fur can get tricky if you use a sewing machine. I usually like to whip stitch fur because with a sewing machine, it'll actually like really lock in that fur and you'll end up with like a really obvious seam. So if you have the time and you're willing and you're patient, using the whip stitch is a really good option. And it's pretty much exactly as it sounds. It's the kind of stitch that like if you don't know how to sew, it's kind of like almost instinctual. You're just gonna take the two pieces and you're gonna stab them through the sides like that. Boom. Stab it through both pieces of fabric. And so just like whip, 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 whip. I think that's why they call it the whip stitch. Because every time I do it, I just go whip. Whip. My wife gets mad. She's like, why can't you sew and not talk? I'm like, whatever, you know, this is my process. This is my thing, okay? So whip, just like that. And let me add a little something here. I don't want to blow your minds. But there's also something called the locking whip stitch, where every stitch, you can do this every stitch, you can do it every like couple stitches, where you end up with this loop, this little extras. Before you pull it tight, you just go back through the loop, boom, just made a knot. And that's called the locking whip stitch. And that's really good because the whip stitch is nice because it'll stretch with your fabric. And if you go and lock every stitch, you'll end up getting it kind of tight and you might end up breaking the thread, which will bust your seam and you gotta go in there and repair it. So it's nice to do like a couple stitches, like 5 or 10, and then lock it. And then 5 or 10 and lock it. And that way you have the strength and you still have the stretch. And if it does bust or break, it won't like completely unravel. So